Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to be speaking on neuroscience as service, and the objective here is to capture the idea that in the silent prayer there's no dogma, and we're going to get into that.
Right.
The question posed is really, does neuroscience reinforce psychotherapy in applying interfaith contemplative prayer to the service of others? And I'm going to be referring to speakers that spoke at the conference that spoke to some of the relevant topics to this question. They'll be posed in red. Why faith and science? Miracles are not contrary to nature, but contrary to what we know about nature. Interesting quote. Another quote, there are only two ways to live your life, as though nothing is a miracle or as though everything is a miracle. Who said those things? Well, the first is St. Augustine of Hippo, and the second is Albert Einstein. So that is why we're doing this. It's basically God has created the universe, and that's the miracle. To ask God for an exception, I think, is rather insulting. So we're going to go and try to understand a little bit. That's about this conference. I like to start with prayer definitions. One is, and these are the etymological terms, etymological definitions. Meditation is meditatio, meaning to think. It focuses on thoughts, including adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication, acts. And it can be the mind alone or verbalized. And contemplation is Latin. Contemplatus means to gaze attentively. Resting in God, it is silent without thoughts, thus opening ourselves up to the gift of divine union. Now, why do I use these definitions? Well, Dr. Finley talked about them a little bit in his talk, and I'm reiterating this because my presentation here is going to be focused on contemplation. Neuroplasticity, brain neuroplasticity. The brain has neuroplasticity. It is not fixed in. And what's rather interesting is Dr. Weissman and Dr. Hammerhoff both alluded to this in their talks, that they're experts in their field. And interestingly, science thought the universe was static. Einstein thought it was static. Then he had to come to the conclusion it was expanding. And neuroscientists followed suit shortly thereafter, realizing that the brain is neuroplastic. It can be changed. Now, brain neuroplasticity, and mindfulness, and I'll talk about this, nature has endowed the human brain with a malleability and flexibility that lets it adapt to the demands of the world it finds itself in. Who said that? Well, as it turns out, it was Dr. Richie Davidson, and he's sitting here with Mathieu Ricard. I had the pleasure of meeting both of them. Richie Davidson has done tremendous research on Tibetan Buddhist EEG scans. Interestingly, though, the Abrahamic faiths believe in a God that dwells within everyone. So why shouldn't there be some connection here? Because science is really capturing reality as everyone should see. Now, I mentioned their research because it was very valid and strong and historic. And I had the pleasure of getting involved in it, not personally involved in their research, but having attended their presentations. Separate from their Buddhist approach, the Handbook of Religion and Health was edited by Dr. Koenig, and he spoke right before Dr. Finley. And he pointed out that if he collected a lot of the research and showed that if we believe in a higher power, you go to church regularly and you pray regularly, you heal better, you have a better quality of life, you live longer, regardless of the religion, as long as the religion didn't have an ogre god in view. And so the question that I had asked myself is, if we have both non-theistic research and theistic research that promotes healing, why not start looking at research that is both theistic and meditation, in the non-theistic approach. Why not look at it both? And that caused the founding of Contemplative Network. Now, Contemplative Network is interested in research on contemplative prayer and the correlations, not the causalities, but the correlations with better quality of life. And some of the speakers at this conference are on the board. Rabbi Harvey Rosenstock, who's an MD psychiatrist, Imam Jamal Rahman, and scientist Jeff Renner, who's the moderator of the conference. So having said that, we're interested in interfaith prayer. And interfaith prayer starts with, again, definitions. What is contemplative prayer? Well, contemplative prayer in our definitions is a gift of divine union by God. It's purely God's action within. Judaism has this form of prayer, Kabbalah, Christianity, mysticism, Islam, Sufism, very similar. Not surprisingly, each morning of our conference, we're having each one of those faith traditions start out by praying in their own tradition. But you'll notice, and I'm sure you've noticed, that in the 10 minutes of silence that they each had, in that silence, there's no dogma. We're interested in that silent period. Now, centering prayer is a method to facilitate contemplative prayer. And we call this interfaith centering prayer because the methods for handling your thoughts that Dr. Finley alluded to in his talk are common amongst all the faith traditions. And now that we're in Rome, we're focused on the Abrahamic faith traditions, but we intend to expand that focus in future conferences. So having said that, there are divine effects from the practice of interfaith centering prayer. The gifts of the Spirit, peace, patience, joy, kindness, gentleness, charity, love, chastity. And they're not unusual, and they happen outside the prayer practice usually. The most common one that's reported is a sense of peace, but God knows what we need when we need it. Mysticism is a different thing. Partial or full out-of-body ecstasy can accompany it, and they happen less often and are often during the centering prayer practice, although not necessarily. They can happen at any time. And we're going to be focusing more on the second here, the mysticism. Mystical experiences. Scientists have started to take them seriously. And what are they? What constitutes them? Surveys have shown that they do exist. The most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mystical. Sounds like a religious leader, right? Actually, no, it's Albert Einstein. It is starting to become accepted that the brilliant insights that scientists have quite often are mystical. And Albert Einstein alluded to this in his writings, that some of his most brilliant discoveries came as mystical experiences. And I won't go into that because it wasn't broadly written, but scientists are starting to recognize this. What are the attributes, the mystical attributes, contemplative, sometimes out of body ecstasy? Well, about 6% of people have them. They're greater than 1 hour or rare. 1 to 2 lifetime occurrences is not unusual. And it's not something necessarily repeats or has to repeat. Greatest percent early in wakefulness at night, which is consistent with scripture, actually, but we'll get into that. We can get into that later. A greater percent lying down, and a greater percent report of floating above. So these are some of the attributes of these experiences. Well, how do we look at this in terms of neuroscience and the brain? Well, the brain has duality, and it has a number of different dualities, but we're going to focus on 2 that are pretty important, the unconscious and the conscious. The conscious is, and I'm just going to give you a sense of what they are both like, just a little descriptions. The unconscious is very fast, the conscious is very slow. The unconscious is automatic, the conscious is systematic. Reactive and proactive. Impulsive and reflective. emotion and reason, limbic system and neocortex in the brain. The limbic system is the oldest part of the brain. The youngest is the conscious part of the brain. And about 95% of the brain is unconscious. Only about 5% is conscious. Dr. Weissman pointed out the universe or discussed the universe and its properties. Only about 4% of the universe is visible. Scientists are starting to see a correlation between the brain structure and the universe's structure. Having said that, the unconscious can be very faithful. What does that mean? Well, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Who said that? Carl Jung. So the question is, how do we get the unconscious to be conscious? Well, some scientists are starting to realize that consciousness and matter are related. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing postulates consciousness. This sounds like a wingnut scientist, off the wall scientist. I don't know if I trust this guy. Max Planck, the Nobel Prize winner for quantum theory. So this is starting to get serious. And that's where the frontier of research is. Now, having said this, I have observed the unloading of the unconscious when I taught centering prayer, interfaith centering prayer to thousands. And I started to notice anecdotal experiences that the people that learned it were having. And I'm going to share those with you because these are the experiences that motivated the research. First was in near-death versus spiritual contemplative experiences. Now, I coined the word spiritual contemplative experiences as mystical experiences, sometimes with ecstasy, that are separate from near-death experiences. Now, quite frankly, a near-death experience can be a contemplative experience, but I coined SCE to kind of make it similar to NDE in letters, but make a distinction between the two. Why do I make a distinction between the two? Well, when I was teaching 10 people this practice of interfaith centering prayer, at the end of their very first 20-minute set, 3 of them started to describe that they had just relived the near-death experience that they had previously had in life. And I was stunned. My eyes popped open and I listened to them share this beautiful experience that they both just relived. And I started to realize that I had to keep that in the back of my head because that actually led to research later. I'm a slow learner. I had to kind of see this stuff happen and then work it out. Bipolar disorder. My wife suffered from bipolar disorder for 45 years of our marriage, 40 years of our 45 years of marriage. At least that was the part that I was aware of it and struggled with it as she did. And I taught her interfaith centering prayer because I realized the ruminations in that bipolar state can be very awful. I mean, it could be awful. And on the manic phase of the bipolar. And to my astonishment, she went into silence for 45 minutes, and I usually practice it for 20, and I let her alone, and she went into a deep state of peace. And from there, she never shared with me completely what happened, but from then on, she was reading the mystics right and left. The peace was brought to her, there's no question. PTSD, I taught 10 people interfaith centering prayer, and a few months later, I ran into one of the people, and a man, and I said, "How's it going?" And he said, "Well," and you knew from what Dr. Finley mentioned, and I mentioned at the beginning of the conference, that practicing interfaith centering prayer, what you do is as you become aware of your thoughts, become aware you're engaged with your thoughts, you ever so gently return to your sacred word. And let go of your thoughts and return to your sacred word, which is a symbol of your desire to be with God. So having said that, I asked this man, how did it go? And he said, well, something serious happened. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, during the prayer, I became fully aware of what actually happened in Vietnam. And I said, what did you do then? And he said, I ever so gently let it go and returned to God. I was stunned. And I told this to one of the top psychiatrists in Houston Medical Center. He was on the board of the Institute for Spirituality and Health that I was vice chairman of. And he's a psychiatrist at the VA hospital where they have floors of PTSD patients. And he said, we have trouble treating PTSD patients. He said, this is amazing. I said, well, now you've got something you can deal with. So we went from there to propose a research project at the VA hospital. Parkinson's disease. I was invited to after a conference where we presented the research we did on NDE versus SCE. I was invited to one of the conference people's homes, actually the organizer of the conference, his daughter, and her husband, both MD neuroscientists, and asked me to teach centering prayer there. And I did. And before everybody arrived, she told me one of the people coming suffers from Parkinson's. Well, right before I was about to start, and the person that had Parkinson's went into a full-blown freeze, which is very indicative of Parkinson's disease. For a layperson, it looks like a seizure, contorted, et cetera, eyes rolling, et cetera. And I got into an argument with God as exactly how I was going to teach somebody in that state. And on top of that, I had to have my teaching translated into Spanish. And so I had the MD husband do that. And within a couple minutes, I'll call him Jose, went into total peace. His hands went down on his legs, his eyes closed. And I brought the people out very quietly at the end of 20 minutes so he could stay in. At the end of 45 minutes, he came out and he got up and he came within an inch of my nose. And he said to me, and I had to have it translated because I didn't understand what he was saying. He said to me, when Castro took over Cuba, and by the way, this happened in Cuba, he took all the children into the countryside to purge them of their belief in God. He said to me, my whole life I've been searching for God, and I finally found him. And all we could do was weep on each other's shoulders. So the question was, if we're going to do research, what tool do we use? And why should we use neuroscience research? Because the answer to that is because the hospitals needed to see concrete evidence, I believed, to be convinced, because I had experience at the VA hospital, to be convinced that this should be looked at for the 80 to 87% of the population that believes in God, as Dr. Koenig mentioned in his talk. And there are different tools you can use. There are both of them. What you want is a tool that gives you both spatial recognition and temporal. In other words, where in the brain it happened and how fast. And for spatial, these are the best tools: CAT scans, MRI, functional MRI. By the way, MRI and functional MRI are pretty much the same, except functional is more of a movie. MRI is a snapshot. Quantitative EEG is good for temporal, but not spatial. SPECT and PET scans are good for both, but they're pretty low quality. We chose quantitative EEG tomography, which is like QEEG, but tomography enhanced by computer. Having said that, first research we did was on NDE versus SCE, and we did in 3 different parts. QEEG, which is a snapshot neural, continuous neural, which is a continuous EEG, and then continuous anatomic assessment. and in each case teaching interfaith centering prayer. And our thought and belief was that if this research was successful, we could demonstrate how we could teach this to people in order to lessen their fear of death if they had a fear of death. Now, I try not to get into too much science here because that's the purpose of this conference was for non-scientists and non-theologians. However, these are NDE SE scans in QEEG, and these are 3D constructed. Now, the question is, how did we pick these patients or subjects? You can't catch people in NDE. And fortunately, the head of this conference that I was at, we presented the research at, and was a collaborator, was one of the world's experts in bringing people out of coma. And I said, well, how do we catch people? And you must have scans of these people when they were dying. He says, yeah, but we don't know whether it was when they were having their NDE. And I said, well, how do we study this? He says, oh, it's considered acceptable to have them remember their NDE, which is, of course, the basis for PTSD. That's why people's memories are triggered. And then I got in touch with a local teacher who teaches interfaith centering prayer, and only those teachers often are told about spiritual contemplative experiences. So he had access to several patients there. So we had 5 of each. And he did the scans in a baseline of NDEE without remembering their experience, and then with remembering. And the scale you can see shows activity, much stronger activity in the frontal lobes. And we're doing this is an example of the alpha wavelength. We did multiple wavelengths. And based on SCE and remembering SCE, and you can see there's a correlation in activity in the frontal lobes, but much more dramatic for SCE. Now, NDE versus SCE in the continuous EEG. These are grand averages of all the patients. And you can see that we looked at the different hemispheres, and the activity was much greater for the NDE, for the SCE, than for the NDE, but there was a correlation during the remembering period. So something happening that is very similar to both. And then we did continuous anatomic assessment. Well, anatomic means heart rate, increased heart rate variability, these kinds of things that are good to have. And they can be, there were correlations there too. Now, there are limitations to this research. Remembering not necessarily the same event, since can remember painful cause rather than ecstasy. In other words, out of those 5 patients, one of them had not a happy remembrance. It turns out that patient was killed. Had a near-death experience because he had a near death from a very painful auto accident. Whereas those who haven't had that, I contend, if there were a study done on this in more depth, people would tend to remember the after-death experience rather than the process of dying through the painful process. So there is a limitation to this research. And the small number of subjects, we only had 5. Now, bipolar disorder, we did that with QEEG, and this is a grand average. And it turns out that there is an abnormality in the bipolar patient in the frontal lobes, and that abnormality disappears after centering prayer. Very interesting. And abnormality is removed after interfaith centering prayer. PTSD, we just completed this research last year. There were 5 patients, grand average QEQT maps in frontal, axial, and sagittal planes. And these are PTSD patients have increased theta activity in the parietal areas, which decreases in the middle of the prayer practice and interfaith centered prayer, and further decreases after 20 minutes. So these theta activities are very very classic for PTSD patients. And after they practice this prayer, these markers disappear. Parkinson's. I don't want to fatigue you with more brain scans. And so I'd like to have you visibly observe what was happening when we taught centering prayer to one of the four patients, although we have videos of all of them. This man is going through a full-blown freeze while he's being taught. And the only caveat I would say here is his wife is teaching him. We taught people how to do this. His wife was teaching him, but she was holding his hand. That's not the normal way we teach, but you watch and you see. Now, it's going to be, you're going to see this in English translation, but you'll hear it spoken in Spanish.
El paciente hace su rutina diaria en 2 ocasiones al día, a veces hasta 3, su centro de meditación acompañado por sus familiares. En este caso, no lo hicimos el de la mañana para llevarlo a su máximo grado de temblor. Esto le ocasiona un estado de ansiedad generalizada, depresión, angustia, y pues vamos a comenzar en breve a realizar su centro de meditación junto a sus familiares y la doctora neuróloga que lo acompaña. Veremos el cambio de antes y después.
These patients cannot be helped by medication. They have too many side effects. These patients no longer have depression because their sleep at night is not interrupted by a freeze. And so they don't get sleep deprivation, and they don't get depressed anymore. So some of the effects of Parkinson's affects depression, and that's been helped. They want to eat now. They want to go out more. And they cannot do without practicing their centering prayer twice a day. And they insist on doing it because they realize God's helping them. The more I examine the universe, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known we were coming. Freeman Dyson, physicist. Now, you thought that was a religious person, right? Well, forget it. Anthropic principle is what he's not referring to the anthropic principle, but the anthropic principle states that of the 4 forces of nature that are known, and the equation is looked at, if those 4 forces were just slightly different, there would be no life in the universe. The probability of having protons, atoms, stars, or life in the universe is 1 in 10 to the 10th to the 123rd power. This is the equivalent of saying that the probability of having a tornado go through a junkyard and on its own build a 747. This is insane. Okay. Consciousness illusion. A human being is a spatially and temporally limited piece of the whole, what we call the universe. He experiences himself and his feelings as separate from the rest, an optical illusion for his consciousness. Interesting. Albert Einstein. We're trapped in a universe of space and time. universe is curved, and Dr. Weissman talked about this. The universe, in her talk, she can talk more about it. The universe is curved just like the Earth, and so if we could travel one direction, we'd come back and wouldn't even sense an edge because we're trapped in the dimensions of space and time. And by the way, what I just said is based on Einstein's general and special theories of relativity. Transcendent events. There's a lot of talk about transcendent events, and we did a comparison between near-death experiences. Dr. Hammerhoff discussed in his talk, was fully aware of this and can address it more about Moody's described ND attributes in 75 and Bruce Grayson's developed scale for attributes, which we used in our research. And now scientists accept that these are real because children are having them and they can describe things there's no way they would know. So that is transcendent event. This is a transcendent event. The SC we researched, Dr. Finley talked about the different forms of prayer, and Dr. James described mystical SC attributes and varieties of religious experience. And then there's the singularity. Dr. Carr addressed this in Einstein's theories that led to singular attributes at the beginning of the Big Bang. Now let's compare these attributes and then ask ourselves, wow, is this interesting? Near-death experiences often talk about the paranormal, out-of-body, SCE, about spaceless ecstasy, often. In the singularity, it's dimensional, it's non-material. Very interesting comparison between these three. Cognitive in near-death experience is timelessness. In the spiritual contemplative experience, if you're practicing interfaith centering prayer, quite often people will say it feels like 5 minutes, but it was an hour or a half hour. The prayer seems short. Well, the singularity at the beginning of the Big Bang was timeless. There's no light. Effective peace and wholeness, perfection, a sense of wholeness. Well, there's ardor in the singularity, zero entropy. Transcendent divine religious, and people speak about meeting with angels or God and a oneness with the universe. You'll hear that quite often verbalized. People have trouble describing these things in words. A oneness with the universe is very common. Dr. Finley mentioned this. Unified four forces. This is basically a unified theory of Einstein. At the time, he only knew of two forces, but now it's carried forward into string theory, etc. And Dr. Carr is able to talk about that, as we said. Isn't it interesting? We can't study these really directly, but or at least I don't know how to do it, but we did study ND and SCE. And I had to ask myself the question, if we're not constrained by space and time, this is that transcendent event between this life and the next. Why not all three having some common attributes? Neuroscience to service, collective oneness. Dr. Carr and Dr. Adamala, atoms of life from singularity to DNA. Minutes after the singularity, hydrogen was formed, which is one of the main two components in DNA, carbon and hydrogen. Dr. Hine, evolution of life from shared DNA. Divine union of the body of Christ in the Christian tradition. Rabbi Duhan Kaplan, interfaith mystical experience, and what she talked about. Why are these mystical experiences common between the different faiths? This concept of oneness. One consciousness. There is the possibility that there is only one self, there's only God, there is only one self or one consciousness, in fact. And in the light of scientific discoveries, if there is one consciousness, it is the infinite, unlimited consciousness of God, which is shared with every creature according to its capacity. Thomas Keating, we've dedicated this conference after. Dr. Hammerhoff spoke of consciousness preceding birth and its surviving death. Is there a connection? So the question about neuroscience's service, which is about this talk, is if interfaith contemplation positively changes our brain, how will that affect our service to others? Well, Contemplative Network seeks funding for expanded research, so hospitals will offer voluntary interfaith centering prayer to 100 to 80% who believe in God. Now, that's partially related to Koenig and why I had thought of this issue of comparing the Tibetan Buddhist research with what Koenig talked about in the higher power research. Now, the Koenig talk about his research, not his editing of a whole different bunches of research showing correlation, was on mostly discursive prayer. In other words, meditation, not contemplation. So research is needed. Physical therapy applies to both muscles and the brain, which is neuroplasticity. Dr. Hammerhoff, in his talk, can address that. So the question is, we intend to expand that research past the pilot stage that I just reported on to in NDE, PTSD, bipolar disorder, and Parkinson's research results, and on a larger sampling of patients, and reported at the Plan 2027 Faith and Science Conference. Dr. Pajolsky, who hasn't spoken yet, will address this.